I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and as part of our Meet the Experts TV documentary panel, I am speaking with Bao Nguyen, the director of the Netflix documentary film The Greatest Night in Pop, about the coming together of the We Are the World single. The first question I wanted to ask was, what was your first exposure to We Are the World, and what did you think of it when you first initially heard it?
Well, thanks for having me on. I was only about 2 years old when the song came out. And so my memories are a bit hazy, to say the least, of when the song came out. In the process of making the film, I started reminiscing about my memories of the song. And it really started in my household. My parents were Vietnamese refugees who had just recently come over to America. And one of the ways that they sort of tried to assimilate into American culture and learn English was listening to American pop records, such as Lionel Richie's records, Kenny Roger records, and then the We Are the World record. And so I just have fond memories of hearing these songs in the background, including We Are the World, growing up. And in many ways, American pop music, pop culture was this bridge between my parents' Vietnamese background and my own upbringing as a young Asian American boy.
So was there, what's really fascinating about the movie is that is hearing all the different individual stories of all the different, artists that were there, something that, it was worthy of what you would hope something like that would have. And I'm curious as to, was there an aspect of the story behind the song that you were very surprised to find?
Well, I think just sort of working through the archival with my archival producer and editors, um, just seeing how vulnerable and nervous a lot of these icons were. I mean, we're talking about the greatest singers of multiple generations, not just one. We have Ray Charles, Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, Diana Ross. I mean, I could spend the entire conversation listing everyone off, but to see them enter the room and be in awe of each other, and also having to sing a line in front of each other was something that I think many people could relate to. Lionel Richie said it in the film, that it felt like the first day of kindergarten. And I think we can all connect to the idea of going into a room that's a new, surprising, and often very anxiety inducing, as you could see, I think specifically with Bob Dylan, who felt very uncomfortable. I just seeing that footage was really eye-opening to me.
Um, I think the other thing that really surprised me about it was how was the humor that we saw with a lot of the stories, and I was wondering, was that something that when so many of those stories went in that direction, did that surprise you, or was that something that you kind of thought might be part of the story?
Yeah, I would say that we always wanted to make a film that was joyous and humorous, and you can kind of get lost in sort of conventional um, behind the scenes process films, but when you add that air of humor, I think it makes it much more engaging for the audience. And we were fortunate enough where we had Lionel Richie in a way be our narrative anchor, since he was there from the conception of the song to the very end. And he's just an amazing storyteller, but also he's just like the funniest guy ever. I was watching an interview with Will Ferrell recently, and Will Ferrell was like, someone asked him who's the funniest person in show business, and he's like, this is an unlikely answer, but if you meet Lionel Richie, then Lionel Richie, you know why Lionel Richie is the funniest guy you'll ever meet.
Um, were there any participants who were tough to convince to be a part of this project, or had a tough time opening up about it?
I mean, I would say that art was imitating life in many ways. Bruce Springsteen didn't originally sign on to the song right away. He had to kind of get convinced for different reasons. And I think having Bruce, he was preparing for his tour. It's sort of the opposite, where with the song he was ending his tour. This time around, when we were making the film, he was preparing for his tour, so he was super busy. but Lionel just gave him a call and said, you got to do this. So that when you have Lionel Richie making the phone calls for you, it's very helpful. And uh, it was a bit of a logistical crapshoot in many ways. Most of the interviews were shot at A&M Studios, which is now Henson Studios in Los Angeles, and that's where the song was actually recorded, and that was really important for us as storytellers to kind of bring everyone back into that space. But it was impossible to get Bruce back into that space, so he was one of the few interviews that we came to him over on the East Coast.
Um, uh, Going back to some of those stories in there, I'm curious. I asked which ones which ones surprised you, but I'm curious also as to whose story in the film got to you the most in an emotional sense.
I would say a couple people. I think kind of answering your previous question too, the most surprising maybe was Sheila E. She really opened herself up and said quite frankly and straightforwardly to us that she felt used in many ways. She thought that some of the people behind the song were using her to get to Prince, and I think that's in the heat of everything that's going on in the politics of trying to get the biggest names, that might have been the case. And she had mentioned that that was the first time she ever shared that sentiment on camera, and something that she'd been holding back for the last almost 40 years now. And that was a very emotional interview, I think, for many people, including her. So that was very surprising and heartfelt. I would also add um, Lionel's line. It's the very end of the film where he talks about returning home, and he quotes his father. And I'm paraphrasing here that when you return home, the house is still there, but the people in the room are not there. And that's how he felt going back to A&M Studios in many ways. And when I first heard him say that story and that quote, I knew that was going to be the end of our film, just because it was so moving, and I think it really tied everything together.
And what I always find really fascinating with documentaries is, I know that you capture so much material in telling the story. And what I was wondering is, were there any stories from about the recording that you really enjoyed, but you weren't able to include in the final cut of the film?
I think one of the things that we wanted to kind of convey more was the impossibility of getting Prince there. And for a long time, we felt, I think as we were editing the film, we were worried that we were staying too long in the recording studio, and that we kind of jumping out into LA looking for Prince was a way for us to kind of get away from the claustrophobia of the studio. Um, but we realized that the footage inside the studio was so incredible that as a viewer, you want to stay in that room, you want to be with all these people. So we did cut out a little bit of the Prince story. Obviously it's still there, but it's definitely shorter than the original version that we imagined, because you see these great icons in a room together. You realize like that's documentary gold in so many ways.
I just have to ask. I mean, when you do a documentary like this, I have to wonder: were you ever? Did you ever? I know you probably wanted to be as professional as possible during making it, but did you ever find yourself being completely starstruck by any of the when you were in the presence of any of these people?
I mean, for me, I think we interviewed Bruce in his home, and I think walking into Bruce Springsteen's home and his studio, his farm is a bit sacred in many ways. But at the end of the day, everyone was so humble and approachable and down to earth, that you're just talking to someone sharing a story at the end of the day. It's not the icon Lionel Richie. It's Lionel Richie, the 30-something-year-old trying to pull off the impossible song. And I think for me, that's an important part of the film, is humanizing these icons that people think are sort of out of reach, or that aren't human in many ways. And I think as you see in the film, as you see through the process of making the song, that we all share these anxieties, these vulnerabilities, and hopefully this hope to kind of make something for the world to make it a better place.
Well, Bao, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our panel in just a little bit.
Great, thank you so much.
I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and today, as part of our Meet the Experts TV documentary panel, I'm speaking with Chloe Sarosh from the Nat Geo documentary series Queens. The first question I have to ask is, I noticed in the credits that a lot of the people who worked on this project were women, and not that that's surprising, but I mean, was that a conscious choice that was made for the making of the series to really make it something that was made by women?
Yeah, and you say it's not a surprise, but actually in our industry for decades, there have been very little women working in this space. So when we decided to make a series about female leadership in the natural world, we knew it had to have the authenticity of being made by a female-led team. But then we looked around and went, but who's going to do it? You know, the number of female cinematographers at this level can be counted on one hand. So we literally had to rip up the rule book of how natural history is made and start again. And it was messy sometimes, and we didn't always get it right, but we're really proud of the legacy we've created. We brought new filmmakers up. We've brought women from underrepresented areas up through this project. So yes, Queens is intentionally, absolutely a female-led team, which is completely unique in this space.
Where did the idea of doing a series about powerful females and female leadership in nature come from?
Well, nature documentaries take a very long time to make. So the first conversations were kind of 5 years ago now. And we pitched an idea for a one-off, which has actually turned into the first episode of the series, which was about lions and hyenas, two very powerful led animal societies, filmed by the two only really women in natural history cinematography that knew them well. And we took that to Nat Geo, and the brilliant exec, Janet Han-Vissering there, said, this is great, but let's make a series. Let's make it all about female leadership. And we thought, well, that's been done. And then we looked back through back catalogs and realized in 2024, it still hadn't been done. And then we saw this unique opportunity to make it a female-led series. And yeah, it took off from there. And it took 4 years to make, a year of research, 3 years in the field filming, over 1,700 filming days, I think. So it's been a labor of love, but we're all incredibly proud of what it's achieved.
It's something that you brought up in your answer to the last two questions. You brought up specifically nature-based cinematography, and I was just wondering if you could explain what is different in nature in that type of cinematography as opposed to regular cinematography that requires that special skill set for this.
Okay, so it's not only the equipment, because we're a very long way away from these animals. We want the animals to behave as they would naturally. Otherwise, we're not making a documentary. We're just making sort of animal entertainment. We want them to be doing what they do, and we want them to do that unaffected by us. So huge lenses and a lot of fieldcraft goes with that. That the specialists know the animals. They know how they're going to behave. Quite often, when we're filming vehicles, or we're using 6-axis gimbal rigs, we're using helicopters, drones. I mean, we borrowed a lot from Hollywood and for drama for this series, which is really exciting. But it may feel like you're up close to the animal and you're looking it in its eye, but that animal is a long, long way away. So it takes very specialist people, and it takes really hardcore people. I mean, some of the locations that we filmed in are I mean, for example, the DRC where the bonobos are, that's a 3-day trek, all the kit on your back. And when you're there, you're camping, and 30 kilometers a day at least following the animals. So the women and the men that worked on this series who helped us are hardcore cinematographers for sure.
What species of animals were the most challenging to tell the stories of, whether that be through capturing the footage or putting it together?
They're all challenging, because as much as I write a script, they very rarely read it. So we never quite know what we're going to get. We spend a lot of time researching, and we speak to the experts and the people in the field that know these animals best, and we go out with the intention of hoping to capture certain behavior, but sometimes it works, sometimes you come with nothing. The bonobos are incredibly difficult because that's physically so challenging. Then if you're filming macro, which is like the bees and the ants, you know, these are tiny, tiny specialist kit. And to get that behavior, you have to create places where they'll make their nests, where you've adapted it so it can be filmed. So there's a lot of time in research and development and hoping that the animals will take to it. A lot of success and failure. Filming with lions and hyenas, you just got to keep up with them. I mean, we had cameras rigged to 4x4 vehicles, and we're pounding through the Ngorongoro crater, which is like that, keeping up with these hyenas who run at speeds. In Ethiopia, we were met with civil war, so we had to get the crew out. It was nothing to do with the animals. That was all on us. But we lost. We couldn't then get back to our filming location for nearly a year while the politics calmed down in that region. So I think every single show had its unique challenges, but it's an enormous privilege to spend time with the animals and get to know them in the way that we did.
So I think probably the most distinctive thing about the show is the wonderful narration that is provided by Angela Bassett. What made Angela Bassett? What's that?
Queen of Queens.
Yes, no question. No question. What made Angela Bassett the perfect person to serve as the narrator for this series?
Oh, do you know what? From the beginning, I was lucky enough to get to write this series, and I think I just always had Angela's voice in my mind, and I think we just manifested it. We manifested it as hard as we possibly could, because she has the life experience, she has the range, because each episode is very different. So she's got the range to go from sort of Shakespearean to humor, some heartbreaking scenes. But also these are stories about the female experience, whether you're an animal or a human. The female experience is universal, and we felt that her life experience would make a show that was really accessible, maybe to people that hadn't watched natural history before. We didn't want the voice of God route that's so expected in natural history. We wanted to absolutely write characters that people saw themselves in, saw their sisters, their friends, their aunts, and Angela was just perfect for that. And her production company represents all those things too. She really backs underrepresented talent. She backs women in the industry. So we sent her early cuts, and we prayed and we hoped, and luckily she loved our queens as much as we did. And then to have her in the recording booth saying your lines is a pinch me moment for sure, because she gives it everything. She's phenomenal in that studio.
How did you do? It's really interesting how you frame the series with each episode. Like you said, the first episode is like centered on Africa with lions and hyenas, and I'm just curious, how did you decide to frame this story in terms of the episodes and what they would each be about?
Yeah, there's a few things going on there. Firstly, we wanted to show different leadership styles, so we wanted to have a range across the series, because just being a female leader doesn't necessarily mean a soft leader. We've got very soft, friendship-based animal societies like the bonobos, or you've got a queen bee who's she's not so kind, she's not so nice, and she gets a comeuppance. But so that we wanted a range of leadership styles. We wanted each episode to feel like a mini movie in its own world, so that you really got to get immersed in the world that these queens rule over. So each place feels very different. And we just wanted variety, and some big glossy sexy animals that people want to see, and some more surprising animals that people perhaps hadn't met before. So it was all about making it as entertaining as possible and as visually exciting as possible. But the hope is at the end, people have really learned something.
Was there an aspect of any of the species the show covers that really surprised you, that really took you by surprise?
Yeah, I think working with hyenas is always a thing. I think people have expectations of hyenas, that they don't like them, and that they are always cast as the villain in every Disney movie. Poor hyenas, they get a terrible rap, and they're actually, spend time with them, they're incredibly intelligent, political, not always kind, but they love their babies hard. And there's a scene in that first episode where the sister who is vying for power kills her sister's daughter. So she kills her own niece as a bid for power. We have that infanticide on camera. It's never been seen before. The scientists knew that it is done, but it had never been seen before. And that was quite hard to watch. And it was quite hard to cut too, to make it palatable for an audience, but was also such a privilege to see that kind of complex politics play out in front of us. But you know, every animal society that we spent time with, we were constantly amazed by the stories that were unfolding in front of us. It was a real privilege to sort of spend that time with them and get to know them.
Well, Chloe, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our panel in just a little bit.
Thanks so much.
I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and today, as part of our Meet the Experts TV documentary panel, I'm speaking with Gotham Chopra, the director of the Hulu docuseries Thank You, Goodnight, the Bon Jovi Story. First question I got to ask you is, what was your first memory of hearing Bon Jovi, and what was your reaction to it upon hearing him?
Gosh, well, I'm of a certain age, so I remember, I must have been a teenager really when Bon Jovi exploded onto the scene with Slippery When Wet. That was probably, I think, like I was 12 years old at the time. So all those, classic songs, Wanted, Dead or Alive, obviously Living on a Prayer. And then I've subsequently sung those songs a million times at karaoke. So my first, I was a 12-year-old boy, so I probably remember the initial cover, which sort of Bon Jovi, if you remember, it was Bodacious Angela. It ended up not being the cover for Slippery When Wet. That was before the internet, so I'm not sure how I saw that, or maybe I'm just going back in time. But yeah, that was I wouldn't say I was a hardcore Bon Jovi fan, but look, Bon Jovi is just one of those anthem-like bands, and still to this day, if you go to any sporting game, and obviously I'm a huge sports fan, you will hear during timeouts, you will hear, in the fourth quarter of a close game, you will hear Living on a Prayer and those types of songs. So it's ubiquitous, and 40 years of Bon Jovi. Now I'm intimately familiar with the music, but those are probably some of my earliest memories.
Yeah, I think last time I went to a Nationals game, I remember at some point hearing "Shot Through the Heart," and of course everybody goes nuts.
Yeah.
This felt like it was a bit of a different type of project for you, because you've done a lot of sports documentaries, and I'm curious as to had you ever done anything like this before, and how long did it take to put together, and did you find that there was any sort of difference in your approach as opposed to the sports documentaries that you'd made?
Yeah, look, on the surface, they're different. Obviously, sports, music, the worlds are different, but in practice, not very different. And, part of the DNA and conception of this film was John had seen something I had done in the sports world called Manning the Arena with Tom Brady, which is really Tom looking back at the 20 years of his life, on the football field. John sort of approached me and said, pretty good. I've got almost 40 years. I think it was year 39 of the band. I'd like to do something looking back. So, look, it's all about greatness and the pursuit of greatness, and how do you sort of build yourself, and what's your legacy going to be? There also happened to be something going on, which wasn't really part of the initial blueprint of the series, which was like John, I noticed early on when I was, meeting with him, that he had something going on with his voice, which turns out to be a vocal injury that, he was trying to figure out how to come back from. Now, there you go. It's like a comeback stories as old as time. I'd done that with Kobe Bryant around his Achilles injury, and working with other athletes around, coming back from a physical injury. So again, very familiar territory. The last part of I guess, it took about 2 years, and this was like a dream scenario. I had breakfast with John in February of 22, and he told me, oh, I'm going on these rehearsals in March. 3 weeks later, I was there filming, and we were up and running. Took about 2 years to put together and finally deliver. But yeah, it was the DNA is a lot of the same things, a lot of the same qualities that make Tom Brady or Kobe Bryant or Serena Williams great are present in John. Talent for sure, but it's like the work ethic, the uncompromising desire to be perfect, is just so familiar. And probably outside of those two domains as well, sports and music.
Surprised that the Jersey Boy was willing to watch a documentary about Tom Brady.
I always joke, I think Tom's like, I think John's the only guy who's actually friends with Tom Robert Kraft, and Bill Belichick. He's like the one guy who has those deep relationships with all three of them.
Does Bill Belichick even have friends? I mean, that's what I'm wondering. Were there any when you were talking to the band members, were there any aspects of their lives that the band members felt hesitant to go into detail about?
Not really. I mean, look, it's a 2-year process. So I think, we just all became closer and there was more trust over the 2 years. And I would say in particular with John, Tico, Dave Bryan, who are three of the founding members, still part of the band. I mean, that was like, I just spent so much time with them, especially around this real-time story of John trying to come back with the vocal injury. He was doing a lot of rehearsals. He went on tour. So I was around those guys a lot. I mean, there was definitely like early on, like, well, one, is Richie Sambora going to participate in this? And turns out that wasn't very controversial. Everybody wanted him to, and then he wanted to once he kind of understood. But there was definitely a little bit of like feeling out process early on, I would say. And I ended up doing 2 interviews with him, and you can feel tonally they're very different. The first one was at the beginning stage, and he literally says, and now it's in every trailer, he says, so what are we going to do? Are we going to tell the truth or are we going to lie? And that was like sort of the vibe. It was sort of playful and fun. And I think there's a history of, not just Bon Jovi, but bands where they kind of like don't necessarily, quote, tell the truth. And so there was a tone to that interview. And then there's an interview that happens maybe a year later where it's like, oh, now, and I think at that point, I know John and Richie had watched some assemblies, and Richie was definitely like, oh, so we are telling the truth. The guys have sort of told their truth. I'm going to tell my truth. And, it has a very different tone to it.
You brought this up a couple times, and so I'm really curious as to what it was like to capture John during one of the most challenging parts of his career with that with the health issues he was having with his vocal cords.
Well, I will say it sucked for him, but it was great for us. I mean, it sort of gave the film, like, I think, like an urgency, like, oh, they built this thing. It's about, it's 40 years, but now there's stakes. Like, will it go on? How is this gonna go on? And so, it was a process, and it was a relationship. And I think John was so focused on his physical therapy, his rehab, figuring out where he was with this thing, that he just, John's a really smart guy. And I noticed this, like, going through the 40 years of archive, like, he's collected all this stuff. He understands the value of having stuff. And so I think in that way, he opened the door, let us document this process that he was going through with some uncertainty around it, just to have it. And then obviously are figuring out in the editorial process, like, how much you need. But, a lot of the, quote, most vulnerable stuff, I mean, you see like him struggling through some of this stuff, surgery, etc. Like, it was me with a camera, and it was not like a big production. You can tell, like, because I have great cinematographers who I get to work with, and Jessica Young in this case, and there's a lot of beautiful shots. And then there's the shots that I was shooting that are not so beautiful, but they're pretty intimate. So hopefully we make up for it in that way.
Was there an aspect of the band that surprised you when you were first meeting with them?
I think it's just like this, the thing about John and the band is that they sort of have this archetypal story to them. Like, they were a bunch of kids, literally in the beginning growing up from New Jersey, and every one of them had a version of, like, we were told this is never going to happen. Like, this doesn't happen to, kids in New Jersey. But this sort of unwillingness, and I do think this is largely John, like, he is like the captain of the ship, certainly with, like, Dave and Tico. I mean, Richie's definitely his own captain. But like, there was just this unwillingness to ever take no for an answer. I mean, to this day, I think in 40 years, with all the many hundreds of millions of albums that have sold, like, they've won 1 Grammy. Like, they are not, the critics' darlings. And I think there's that, and this again goes back, it's very similar to sports, this self-defined underdog. It's us against the world. And, like, these are guys who have been very successful, they live large now. They have, you know, beautiful homes and beautiful lifestyles and stuff like that. But there's still this sort of like these, you know, kids from New Jersey who are told they're never going to make that. You can feel it inside of them. It's us against the world. And I think that was sort of surprising. And they kept on doing that like over and over, you know, even after Slippery When Wet and New Jersey, which like was its own zenith in the late 80s. The band, I wouldn't say broke up, but like they went their separate ways. And when they came back, everybody was like, oh, I mean, this is now never going to happen again. And then Keep the Faith happens. And, you know, you can see that sort of arc pretty much over and over and over again across 40 years.
Well, Gotham, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our panel in just a little bit.
Can't wait.
I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and today, as part of our Meet the Experts TV documentary panel, I'm speaking with Dorsay Alavi, the director of the Amazon Prime Video docuseries Wayne Shorter, Zero Gravity. First question I wanted to ask you is, how did you decide to frame this docuseries, and what was the journey that led you to that decision?
Well, how do you tell a story about a man who has contributed 60 years to American music and has had a full, rich life and was continuing to create well into the end of my shooting days? And my long relationship with Wayne Shorter of 3 decades, I had personal insight into his life. And when I started the documentary, I really didn't know where I was going to go with it. I was just going to let my subject lead me. And Wayne just kept surprising me. I just couldn't believe the amount of the body of work he was creating, the influence he had on so many musicians. So I originally set out to do it as a feature. And then what happened is I kept shooting and more information kept coming through. And I realized that, you know, I had this responsibility to capture the full breadth of his life. And so I decided to do it in 3 portals. And I call them portals because the audience is transported into 3 pivotal periods of his life that were influential to him and to others in music, but also his personal life. So I felt originally I had 4 hours, and I showed it to a friend. He's like, okay, I think, you know, you could trim this down. Less is more, you know, shooting, you don't have to tell everything. And so we finally landed on this 3-hour cut. It could be a feature in 3 parts, but it really turned out to be the best format was as a limited series. And we're so happy that Amazon embraced it. And that's how it came to be.
That actually answers my second question about why did you choose the term portal. The other thing that so I'm curious as to how did you first become familiar with Wayne Shorter's music, and then then how did you become familiar with him as a person, and what was your reaction to hearing his music for the first time?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I listened to jazz, but I didn't know that I was listening to Wayne Shorter because Wayne Shorter played with Miles Davis. He played with Art Blakey. So I was familiar with the jazz standards and I was listening to it often, but had no idea that Wayne Shorter had written some of those compositions. So I was a music video director at the time, and my agent called me and said, hey, we want you to direct a music video for Verve Records. It's on the jazz legend Wayne Shorter. And I went, Wayne Shorter, who's that? And I started doing research and I went, wow, he is so influential. And why do I not know about him? And so I was fascinated. And so when I met Wayne, I got to know him as a human being, and he's such a fascinating person. And so I did the music video and we stayed friends for life. But I grew to learn about Wayne's music and started listening to it and hearing others talk about his influence. It just sort of, I fell in love with the sounds he created. And I saw that he had a vast sounds in different genres that I had no idea about. And so I wanted to capture all of that and visually translate it in the film.
Was it a conscious decision on your part not to use many talking heads in the movie, because there are a couple, but there aren't really that many? Was that a conscious decision on your part?
Yes, it was. I wanted people to experience his music, not hear about it, because that actually, I didn't want it to be so academic, and I didn't really want to just talk about the music, because that's how Wayne was. He didn't want to talk about the music. He wanted you to experience it firsthand. So I had to create a lot of imagery to give you that experience, of that transcendent experience you get when you listen to Wayne Shorter's compositions. So yes, it was intentional. And also I didn't want to do a classic documentary about a jazz musician who had a tragic life. Wayne had overcome so many obstacles, but I wanted you to feel like you actually were there, that you were experiencing it. And so that the talking heads was somewhat of a distraction in doing that.
During the time that you spent filming Wayne, what were you most struck by during that, specifically for this documentary? Because I know you had known him for many years prior.
It's interesting. Sometimes I would ask Wayne a question and he would take me on this journey that I felt never really addressed the question. And I kept thinking, did he actually answer that? But it was so fascinating, the journey he was taking me on with the stories he was telling. It wasn't until later that I realized that he had answered the question, but the answer was so profound that I actually didn't grasp it in the moment. And I found that with a lot of the musicians who just have a colorful way of expressing themselves. And it was really refreshing not to have, okay, he told me the story of his life, here's the answer to this. It was always a very interesting, unconventional answer. And it forced me to be much more creative with my questions.
I know that Wayne passed away in, I believe it was 2022. But I was wondering, did he get a chance to see any sort of cut of the project, and what was his reaction to it, if he did?
Yes, Wayne saw the film several times. He loved it and watched it often. I was always surprised. I'm like, Wayne, you're going to watch it again? He said, yeah. So he loved it. I think that he felt that I had captured his imagination and his love for many things like movies and science fiction, but also the spiritual and humanistic aspects of his life.
So I'm curious as to, if you were to talk to someone who had never listened to Wayne Shorter's music, but was looking, for like an entry point into it, what would be your recommendation for a couple of recordings to listen to start down that road of appreciating his music?
Well, I love Speak No Evil. I love Speak No Evil. I love Infant Eyes. Those are his earlier works, but they just have something very special, and they're so complex, but yet so tangible. I think it's easier to enter Wayne's composed, music cues rather than his improvised. And then you can slowly graduate into the more improvised pieces that he does with his orchestra, which are amazing.
And who do you think he was, because you also mentioned that he did a lot of collaborations. Who do you think he had his best collaborations with?
Well, I would say Herbie Hancock. I think Herbie and Wayne took a lot of what they learned with Miles Davis and they applied it to their collaborations. There's a certain freedom to the way they work with each other. They were very connected on so many levels. There was an unspoken language they had with the music. Also, his quartet was phenomenal. The zero gravity aspect was that they could fly off the page and reach this heightened state of consciousness while they're improvising that was beyond the five senses, and it transmitted to the audience. And people would go in and hear them play and feel completely like they were transformed by the end of the night. And so that kind of collaboration was very rich, and they understood Wayne. They would play off the page, but they could fly off the page. I think those collaborations were most meaningful for Wayne, and then later with the orchestras that he collaborated with.
Well, Dorsay, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our panel in just a little bit.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and today, as part of our Meet the Experts TV documentary panel, I am joined by Bao Nguyen, the director of the Netflix documentary film The Greatest Night in Pop, Chloe Sarosh from the Nat Geo documentary series Queens, Gotham Chopra from the Hulu documentary series Thank You, Goodnight, the Bon Jovi Story, and Dorsay Alavi, the director of the Prime Video docuseries Wayne Shorter Zero Gravity. The first question I want to ask is, I love hearing from people who work in documentaries what made them want to get involved with this genre and this type of filmmaking. So I'm curious as to what was the documentary you saw that made you say that I want to do that? And I'll go first to Chloe.
Oh, well, I work in natural history, and I'm drawn to stories of the natural world because the natural world needs as many people to love it right now as can possibly love it. It's in crisis and it needs everybody to be in love with it and to care. I mean, I grew up watching Attenborough, and I think we all did. We all love those stories from our childhoods. But what I particularly love is the idea of kind of crossing mediums. So I also watch a lot of drama and a lot of reality TV. And I love sort of the idea of kind of blending our genres and making something for a new audience that maybe hasn't felt that natural history is for them to this point, because we need to reach those audiences. We need the younger audiences. We need a more diverse audience because the natural world deserves it.
And what about you, Gotham?
I mean, my background mostly is in sports doc. So, Hoop Dreams was one of probably the seminal ones. I'm also by background a reporter originally, so a lot of the more Errol Morris, Fog of War, those types of, also just from maybe a filmmaking technique. Errol Morris obviously being such a pioneer in so many different ways. But there's so many. I mean, just incredible. What I love is, I always sort of say they call it unscripted for a reason. And everyone is different and they take shape and. So, I mean, I'm a fan of everybody here also, and influences all around.
And Dorsay?
Well, I come from a narrative background, mostly art house cinema and independent filmmaking, but I would say Wim Wenders' Salt of the Earth, Salgado documentary. I'm very drawn to character-driven films. So in the same vein, I wanted to tell a story that was character-driven, even though it was a documentary, but actually could feel like a film rather than a typical documentary. So I would say art house, Wim Wenders. I loved Pina as well.
And Bao, how about you?
Yeah, I'll piggyback on what Gotham said. And Hoop Dreams was probably one of the first documentaries I saw. I was still very young, but just seeing this epic longitudinal story, but still be so intimate and personal, really inspired me. I would also say there was a film called Up the Yangtze by Young Chang, who, at the time I hadn't seen many Asian American documentary filmmakers, and I got to see that film at Silver Docs and saw a Q&A with Young, and I was like, even though the film, now I know documentaries are very hard to make, but when I watched the film and heard his Q&A, I was like, oh, he looks like me. We have a similar background. Maybe it's not so hard. 15, 16 years later, I realize it's much harder, but I think there's such. I'm very grateful to work in this field, because I think we're not just storytellers. We're very much caretakers of stories, because these are real people's lives. These are things that matter, and so feel very privileged to be in this field.
The Silver Docs, that's the AFI festival in Silver Spring, right?
It was, yeah. Now, sadly, it's not the same anymore.
Unfortunately, nothing's the same as it used to be. But I moving away from what was the documentaries that inspired you, I'm always interested to hear what filmmakers and people behind the scenes of movies and TV are currently watching. And I'm curious as to what was the last documentary film or series you saw that really like wowed you, that floored you? And I'll go to you first, Dorsay.
Four Daughters. I thought that was incredible. The play with the fictionalizing, using actors and using the actual subjects. I thought it was very powerful. I thought it was excellent in how they decided to structure the documentary and use what they didn't have. I thought it was very innovative. It was gut-wrenching, difficult to watch, but it was one of my favorites this year. There was a great year, I think. 20 Days in Mariupol was amazing as well. I was very taken with that. I felt like I was really there, and very brave filmmaking.
And Chloe?
Yeah, I was actually going to say the 20 Days of Mariupol for me was unbelievable. I think incredibly hard to watch, but that's so important sometimes. And probably like everyone here, then I have to go and watch a bit of trash and make up for it, and then I go back in and watch something. But that was so brave and so immediate, just beautiful. But I also love it when documentaries sort of mix up genres. So I was just last night I was watching something because I love a bit of ancient history, and I was watching a Netflix doc about the Neanderthals, and there's recreated drama in there. They'd used they'd used a lot of natural history footage. They blended it together, and it was just so interesting. So and I love watching music docs as well, but we're not going to get into that because you guys know much more than I do about that. But yeah, it's too difficult to choose.
And what about you, Bao?
Earlier this year, I watched Eno, documentary about Brian Eno, and it's self-proclaimed generative documentary where no cut is the same as the previous cut. So it's hard to explain, and it sounds a bit of a gimmick, to be honest. And that's what when I went in to watch it at Sundance, I thought, oh, how am I going to really enjoy this and feel grounded in a story? But the way that it's created and how it reflects the ethos of Brian Eno is really amazing. And so I hope everyone gets to see it, and then the version that you see will be totally different from the version I see.
And Gotham?
Well, you're gonna think I'm pandering, but Bao's movie, because music is like a different, I've just sort of entered into this realm. And so even during the process of making this, I was just like looking around, and Greatest Night of Pop, which was like such a phenomena, like on Netflix, was something I watched and felt really just excited by. So that's probably the most recent, but I also go back and look at things that, so it's kind of like your first question. Again, back in the world of sports docs, The Two Escobars is like one of my favorite because it blends like sports and politics. And so I love that. And, Navalny, like I thought was brilliant. So that's something maybe watched a year or two ago. So yeah, I just, it is, I think like actually, you were saying, Chloe, like the medium is constantly shifting and it needs a lot of attention. I'm fortunate, like I work with a lot of different filmmakers, and we've sort of built this company that, I like to think of as creator driven. And so I'm watching a lot of stuff like in various forms, and keeps me really busy. But, this industry, I think is getting better, but it's shifting constantly and everything's collapsing onto itself. So, it takes constant attention, like keeping an eye on what's happening.
And something I'm also curious about is, we live in such crazy times. I'm curious. It feels like, documentaries can be some of the most important things for people to consume, but it also feels like on a certain level that there are certain things that might be threatening to documentary filmmaking. And I'm curious as to if any of you see threat or potential challenges or threats to making good documentaries or truthful documentaries these days. And I want to start with you, Bao.
Well, I think the threats are not just sort of focused on documentary. I think it's sort of the screen industry as a whole and art as a whole. There's so much, and I hate the term content, but for the lack of a better term, there's so much content nowadays, and we're all vying for people's attention. And so by thinking about it in terms of an attention economy, I think we're forgetting a lot of the reasons that we make art and why we make films. And it's not just the problem of the industry, but I think it's sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy for us as filmmakers and storytellers of like, how do we get this project made? We have to do XYZ to meet like a market demand. And I hope that sort of mentality shifts in a way. And it takes a large amount of actors in order to do that, rather than blame it on, I guess, a certain sector of the industry.
And Dorsay?
On the creative side, I think it's still very important to have individual voices and not lean on anything that's formulaic. I think what the risk is that if we start to formalize the documentary process and always choose what's sensational rather than what's more subtle or what's needed at the time, people tend to focus on, oh, is this a big enough name? Is this does it have something sexy to it? It loses its authenticity. I think for filmmakers, you have to choose what you're passionate about, and it's not always aligned with the marketplace. So the challenge of any filmmaker, whether it's narrative or documentary, is staying true to the subject matter, but also finding alternative outlets to get your work out there so you can stay true to the subject. And also not feel like you have to participate in, oh, I've got the biggest name, the biggest, it's going to have the biggest eyeballs. So I would say staying true to the content and also finding alternative ways of getting the work out there.
And Gotham?
I mean, I'm not sure I could say it any better. So I don't envy you, Chloe, having to go after this. But I think we live in the algorithmic economy, so we're constantly responding to, and I feel like I pitch the same, group of people over and over and over again. I think it's easy to get caught up in that and try to chase the latest trend, but these things take forever to make also. So by the time you make it, then like the trend has changed. I again work with a group of incredible filmmakers, and the thing we sort of nerd out and talk a lot about is the only algorithm that matters is Joseph Campbell. Like, focus on story, and story is an art, and story is like everything else. It's work, and you have to practice the craft. And we're all living in short form. The long form seems to be making a resurgence. I did a whole bunch of stuff called mid form, like when Facebook watched, and that came and went. But it's like at the end of the day, it's about storytelling. It's great characters, it's conflict, it's tension, and so I try to focus on that, and sort of stay away from the threats, because yes, the industry is under siege, and it's constantly shifting. And if you sort of try to gamify it, I feel like it changes right beneath your feet,
And what about you, Chloe?
Well, we have one very practical issue in our sector of the industry, which is climate change, because nothing is the same anymore. We go out to film things and the world has changed and nothing is predictable, and what we thought we might find there is not. And that's really difficult. But also a similar vein to what these guys have brought up, we desperately need new voices in our sector of the industry. Queen's brought through new voices, it did that, but we left the door open. But my concern is, as the industry contracts and people play safe, those new people that we found who have so much promise and whose voices we need to hear will be forgotten about again because they're deemed as risk. And that sense of risk aversion, I think, could be really damaging for us. So we just have to keep pushing on that door and keep help new filmmakers come through in any way we can. But yeah, it concerns me. And
for my last question, I just wanted to I like having a little bit of fun with this, since we are an awards website. If I'm curious as to if any of you were to win something, what is your ideal walk-up music as you would make your way to the podium? And Gotham, you're up first.
I mean, having just done a Bon Jovi, I think it would be sacrilege for me to talk about any other band. In the vast catalog, 40 years, maybe I'd go back to a classic. So, Living on a Prayer, probably, John hitting that high note, which, much to his chagrin, he can't hit right now. But yeah, I think that would be the one that I would use as my walk-up music.
And Dorsay?
Well, I'll go with something kind of, I would say I have to have Wayne Shorter's music behind me. It would make the most sense. So I would either go with Speak No Evil or Pegasus.
And Bao, would it be We Are the World for you?
I mean, that's the obvious answer, right? So
Do you have it? Do you have another like personal one that you would want?
I mean, if I picked like another Lionel Richie song, maybe like Dancing on the Ceiling or something, just as a fun one to walk up stage on.
And what about you, Chloe?
We're really lucky. We had an original theme written for us by a young British Black artist called Aloya, and she's Ethiopian Egyptian, and her sound is so cool. And she wrote this theme tune for us, which is all about the power of Mother Nature. So I would be thrilled to have that playing. It's a great tune.
Well, Bao, Gotham, Chloe, and Dorsay, thank you so much for joining us. We wish you all the best. And keep coming to goldderby.com to make your Emmy predictions in advance of the nominations coming out in July. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.